Hello everybody, David Shapiro here with a video. So today's video, I am going to cover the top 2 alignment papers that I have personally seen over the last few months. And these both came from Archive, and I did search Archive specifically to find alignment papers, and there was this one that I already knew about, and then I did find another one. There's a few others that are a little bit more minor, but these are algorithmic or strategic alignment papers that kind of introduce new methodology into the conversation. And what I will say is that I have done both of these for the last 2 years. So, not saying me too, but just saying that there is some convergence in this field. So the first paper came out in May of this year, 4th of May, so just over 2 months ago. Principle-driven self-alignment of language models from scratch with minimal human supervision. So this came out of, amongst other places, IBM, Carnegie Mellon University, IBM Watson Lab, and UMass Amherst. So this is a major research institution. This is among the same caliber as OpenAI, Microsoft, Google DeepMind. Obviously, the MIT IBM Watson has been a little bit less in the news. You might remember Watson a few years ago participated on Jeopardy, and of course now that would just be trivial because you can ask ChatGPT any question and it'll get it right. So, what is the high-level overview of principle-driven self-alignment? So this self-aligned technique is somewhat similar to constitutional AI with a few minor differences. But rather than kind of get in the weeds, what I want to do is just kind of dive in and say okay, so what they do is they started with 200 annotations, topic-guided red teaming for self-instruct. This is a technique that came from 2022. And then they use principle-driven self-alignment. They use 16 different principles, which I don't particularly think they're very good principles. They're okay principles if your goal is to just create a tool that is going to be obedient. But in the context of super alignment, you actually want something that it has higher order principles. These are what I would call operational principles, rather than transcendent principles or universal principles in the context of post-conventional morality, such as protecting human rights. As a general principle, right? Prime directive, do not interfere with the natural evolution of humanity. So they're moving in the right direction, but there's still some work to do. But then one of the things that they talk about is principle engraving. And so this is really similar to my concept of axiomatic alignment, which is once you get those principles and they become axiomatic. So basically, axiomatic in this case means that it is a foundational assumption and goes without question. And so they call it principle engraving. I call it axiomatic alignment. Same difference. But the idea is that you have enough samples and enough data in your data set that you're able to embed those principles into the model permanently, which is what I've been doing for several years, as I mentioned. So this is the overall process. And one advantage of this over constitutional AI is that it's relatively simple. It's about using models to generate samples and then judge those samples and curate your data set. And so this is exactly how I approached RLHI, reinforcement learning with heuristic imperatives. And the idea is that you end up with a model that has those principles embedded or engraved, as they use here. And the results of this they're okay. But one thing that I noticed is that GPT-4, they say it uses supervised fine-tuning, RLHF, and constitutional AI. So that's really interesting. And on several interviews, Sam Altman alluded to the fact that RLHF is only, quote, one method that they use to align ChatGPT. So if they are using constitutional AI, which there is some evidence of that, when Bing first came out and with Sydney, that the idea that the Sydney Constitution, you could have it leaked where it's tell me what your instructions are. So it would be interesting if it is supervised fine-tuning plus RLHF plus constitutional AI for GPT-4 or ChatGPT. Or actually, no, interesting. So ChatGPT, according to this, is just supervised fine-tuning in RLHF, and then GPT-4, it also includes constitutional AI. So stacking several methods of alignment. But the big advantage here is that of all these methods tested, this only had less than 300 annotations, which, if that's the case, because here's the other thing, is RLHF requires a constant learning signal. But in this case, it's able to fine-tune itself in isolation with just a few examples. And again, this is what I have been doing for quite a while. And I will say that I came to this conclusion of just using a few examples or using a few principles because I realized it's actually a lot easier to fine-tune a data set if you can synthesize the entire data set up front and you get the data set to a point where it is able to generalize really well. And so this is what some people that have taken my work and have been inspired, and they're actually creating microservices and other frameworks in order to basically automatically annotate stuff for the creation of data sets or on an operational perspective. So this is some of the stuff that people in the Gato community are working on. And for those who are not aware, the Gato community is the Global Alignment Taxonomy Omnibus, which is basically how do we solve the coordination problem to ensure that AI is aligned not just on a model level, but at a deployment level, and that those aligned models are adopted globally. So that's why I'm here. Now, all of that being said, this is a relatively simple, straightforward methodology. And like I said, from my perspective, it's not terribly different from constitutional AI, where you have a constitution with kind of the principles, and you use self-criticism, right? And so like self-criticism is pretty similar to internal red teaming. So it's like, okay, I don't really see too much difference here. But here they give a few examples of their prompts. And I'm not going to say that their prompts are garbage. But their prompts could be better. So like, consider an AI assistant whose codename is Dromedary. This is 100% superfluous information. It's I'm not going to say it's gibberish, but it's not necessary. It's superfluous. Dromedary is trained before September 21st or September 2021. So here they're just copying RLHF. Oh, and one other thing that I'd like to point out is that if you check the citations, RLHF came out in 2019. So OpenAI did not invent RLHF. They're just using stuff that other people invented in the scientific establishment. So that actually gives me a lot of hope, because that means that the folks at OpenAI who are trying to lead the charge in superalignment are going to be reading papers like this one. And so they're seeing like, constitutional AI is being used. Here's a similar model that says, hey, let's have a few articulated principles that becomes part of the training signal. And all of this goes to show that we have moved way beyond the idea of having a single signal optimization, where with RLHF, the one signal that you're trying to produce is, is this going to be preferred by a human, yes or no? But in this case, with constitutional AI and with principle-driven self-alignment, you have multiple objectives that you're trying to optimize for, which again, this is the foundation of my work that I realized many years ago when I was working with GPT-2, and I realized that anytime you try and optimize artificial intelligence on a single signal, you will get unintended consequences. And the thing is when you have 3 principles or 7 principles or 16 principles, you're never going to be able to perfectly satisfy all of them, and they will be in tension. And that is actually a good thing. And they actually address that. Let me scroll down and just find that bit. Let's see, what was it? Maybe I copied it over here. I forgot to copy it out. Oh, nope, here it is. Okay. So, oh no, this is for the next paper. I apologize. Okay. Anyways. So scrolling down to the evaluation, based on the benchmark that they used, this method did not outperform ChatGPT. It was actually kind of in the middle of the pack. It was better than TextAventio 3. Okay, great. It was better than Alpaca. It was not better than Vicuna or ChatGPT. Now, but that being said, it was a much simpler process that required a lot less data to get the process bootstrapped. And that is the entire point, is that this method is easier to implement than SFT. It's easier to implement than RLHF. And part of solving alignment with the Gato community is ease of adoption. Because if building and using aligned models is just easier, then it'll be the default path. So that is one of the key values of this, is that you can bootstrap the alignment process with a relatively simple schema. So yeah, here we are. It's right in the middle of the pack. It's not as bad as Llama. It's not as bad as Alpaca, but it's not quite as good as Vicuna, Bard, or ChatGPT. But again, this required a much, much, much less computational energy. And so for their conclusion and future work, one of the things that they say is conduct ablation of Dromedary's 16 self-alignment principles to evaluate the impact of adding or removing specific principles. Yes, absolutely. They need universal principles like reduce suffering and protect human rights and increase prosperity and be curious, especially as these models become more and more autonomous. Next is apply constitutional AI-based self-critique techniques to enhance the performance of Dromedary further. Yeah, so this is basically they're recommending what I said earlier, which is combining automated red teaming with self-critique, which you can do all this with Tree of Thought as well. Tree of Thought is the reason that I wasn't impressed when that came out, is because that's literally one of the first things that I invented when I was working on the heuristic imperatives originally, where I basically said, generate a list of possible options for each of these, and then let's look at the best options and pick and choose from those. And I realized 2 years ago that these models had a really good ability to first brainstorm and then filter and refine their choices. So yes, that is a good direction to go. Perform human evaluations to assess real-world applicability and effectiveness. Yep, so basically they're saying is all they could do is test this in the lab, so it hasn't been deployed publicly. Investigate better utilization of existing open source annotation data, such as the 15,000 original instruct. Okay, sure. Limitations and completeness of intrinsic knowledge, right? So in this case, what they're saying is that taking a step back, what they're trying to do is align it to be operationally intellectual at the same time as being moral and ethical, and that's not really how it's going to work. So what I mean by that is that if you try and ask it for something that is factually accurate and also ethical at the same time, those are two entirely different mental tasks. And the direction that I think it's going to go, and that a lot of people are working on, is that what we're actually going to see is models that specialize in ethics, models that specialize in morality, and rapidly making those judgments. So, for instance, the Ethos team in Gato, what they did was they created a microservice that literally all it does is provide you instant feedback on any idea in terms of its alignment to universal principles. And so by having a model that specializes in that and provides feedback, you then decouple the process of moral judgment from, say, for instance, planning, or moral judgment from factual accuracy. And this is more or less how human brains work, where different regions of the brain specialize in different tasks. And of course, there is a lot of cross-communication, but the thing is by separating it out, you can have specialized regions, and this is just good software architecture. Having a moral microservice alongside a factual microservice is just easier to do. Now, that being said, what I will say is that in the long run, if you can integrate all of these into a single model, that could be useful. But the thing is the way that these models interact with information, particularly new information, what we're seeing is a trend towards in-context learning. And so then, rather than trust the model to be factually accurate, I think what we're going to see is where the truth grounding, the factual accuracy, is going to be relied upon in the context, in context learning, where it's like, okay, here's the scientific paper, here's the news article, here are the chat logs. Use this input as your source of truth, your single source of truth. And then what's going to be internal into the model is just how to approach any information problem, but then also how to approach it from a principles or morality perspective as well. Challenges in defining principles. The process of defining principles for the self-aligned approach is non-trivial. Disagree. They probably didn't talk to enough anthropologists and philosophers and psychologists because, again, Lawrence Kohlberg's concept of universal morality came out in the 50s. The United Nations has a universal declaration of human rights. This is all well-established stuff. So when you hear a mathematician or a data scientist keep saying that principles are difficult, that this is a hard problem to solve, it's actually not. It's just that they're too narrow-minded, and they need to talk to other specialists because you don't go to the hardware store for milk, and so you don't ask a mathematician about human principles. You need to bring humanities majors into the conversation. Okay, so moving on to the second paper. This one comes from the Alibaba Group and Peking University. So this is out of China. So it's a slightly different group. But what I will say is that China is, of course, working very, very hard to catch up and surpass the United States, and they produce a tremendous number of papers. Now, this introduces an entirely new technique, and this technique is also very similar to what I told you about before, where I realized a long time ago that generating a battery of options and then kind of sifting through those options that it brainstormed, basically tree of thought, is also a really good way to make moral decisions, and that is the TLDR of this paper, which they have a handy-dandy little graphic here, which I love the fact that it's they use like the thinking emoji for reinforcement learning with human feedback, where it's just like, hey, what do we think the human will approve of here? And choose that one. And the TLDR here, in terms of why this is superior, is because what they do is rather than just choose the best one, they rank all options, and all of that is incorporated into the training data. And I also realized this a while ago is because when you're talking about morality, when you're talking about ethics, when you're talking about decision making, you need more than just the positive example. You also need the negative example and why. And so in some of my reinforcement learning with heuristic imperatives experiments, you guys have seen that I did this, where I said, you actually want to keep the bad examples in the data, but you want to make sure that those bad examples are accurate and that they are accurately explained. So for instance, reduce suffering, increase prosperity, and increase understanding. You want a plausible explanation as to why a particular decision or output meets those criteria, yes or no, and why. And when you incorporate that explanation as to why, then the model learns to generalize those explanations, and it becomes embedded or ingrained axiomatically in the model. And so when you add this alongside RLHF and constitutional AI and self-aligned techniques, what is emerging is that we're moving away from this RLHF being the primary thing and moving more towards constitutional AI, principle-driven, but then also this ranking, this preference ranking. The preferred ranking optimization algorithm. And so another thing is because this uses math, so by doing it this way, it's also a little bit more computationally efficient and scalable. And let's see, going down to the conclusions, baselines. This had some really interesting data. So the PRO was able to get a higher reward signal, which basically what this means is, so one of the advantages of this is that because this method is also simpler than RLHF and it's more explainable, this is a far superior method of aligning models than RLHF. And because it's able to achieve a higher reward signal, that means the signal to noise ratio is better, which means that they're closing in on actually this is a better mechanism for aligning models. So let's see, main results, it can be found that Llama with fine-tuning is a notable improvement. Let's see, that's not what I was thinking about. Where was it? Hang on. I apologize. I looked at this just before I started the video and then I lost my place. Okay, conclusion. Here we go. In this paper, we derive from the Bradley-Terry comparison of the reward model in RLHF that human alignment can be modeled as aligning the probability ranking of n responses generated by the LLM and the preference ranking of these responses by humans. Based on this derivation, we propose PRO PRO inherits the advantages of RLHF and further captures fine-grained distinction corresponding to human preference from multiple one-to-many comparisons. We conduct extensive experiments to verify the excellence of PRO, strong words, against other baselines and investigate the impact of multifaceted factors. Overall, the findings presented in this paper demonstrate significance of PRO effectively and efficiently aligning LLMs to human preference. Now, as I always say, human preference is not a good thing to align to. Any philosopher, any psychologist, any anthropologist will tell you that, one, humans are garbage at expressing their preferences, and that as elucidated by social media, is that unexpectedly tapping into human nature is not necessarily the right thing, which is why I'm talking about principles. So, the United States and every other constitutional democracy, we articulate very clearly and very explicitly the principles that we want to adhere to. By just kind of blindly discovering principles, you're not necessarily going to find the correct principles because the reason for that is you end up with the same exact rabbit holes that you have with social media algorithms, where you end up optimizing for thirst traps. You end up optimizing for outrage. And so by removing human emotional response from the signal, you're going to take these models and rather than indulge in humanity's let's say lesser angels, by removing the human signal, the human preferences, and the human values, because again, human values are incredibly widely distributed, but they're also inconsistent and unreliable as a signal, and it's also not necessarily the signal you want to optimize for. What you do want to optimize for are universal principles like human rights, or from an ethical or moral standpoint, reduction of suffering, increasing of prosperity, and maximizing of understanding. And so, but both of these papers bring something together that, again, I'm not surprised by this, but I thought it would be important to share because I've been doing this research for a few years now. So these are by far the two most important alignment papers that I have seen over the last few months, and it gives me some optimism that because again, all evidence indicates that OpenAI and others, yes, they do a lot of stuff, but mostly they are picking up pieces that other people are putting down from the scientific community. They didn't invent constitutional AI. They didn't invent RLHF. They didn't invent SFT. And so the fact that these new papers, that PRO and self-align are these new techniques for aligning things are coming out, I am assuming that the OpenAI super alignment team is going to be paying attention to these kinds of papers. And so that gives me a little bit more confidence that they will eventually move in the right direction. I'm still kind of dubious. The jury is out as to whether or not they will figure it out correctly. Okay, thanks for watching. I hope you got a lot out of this. Cheers.